What's up YouTube? Today what we're going to be doing is changing carriage bearings on an FC. This happens to be a 5200, but it's pretty much the same for most forklifts, this procedure, so let's get to it. The first thing you want to do is you want to remove any attachments that are on the forklift. You want to be able to get to the fork carriage itself, because we're going to have to slightly remove the fork carriage from the forklift. So what I'm doing here is I'm just strapping this happens to be a single double attachment, I'm strapping it to a pallet so that when I remove it, it doesn't fall backwards and flop over. You're going to want to make sure it doesn't do that. The next thing I'm doing is I'm just setting the fork carriage down onto jack stands, and this is just so that I can continue to lower down and get the front chain and hoses slacked enough so that I can remove them. They need to be taken off of this yoke here so that when we lift the intermediate rail up, none of that stuff pulls on the fork carriage. I'm just removing the bottom chain pin here, and then that way I'll pull the chain up through that pulley and completely out and just lay it over the dash of the truck. Now, since the chain anchor is still in the cylinder mounting point, what I do is I put a chain underneath it and I route it over top of the yoke, because what we're wanting to do is simulate the free lift cylinder being all the way to the top, but we don't want it to go all the way to the top, because if you do this without chaining it and you go all the way to the top, it has the tendency to blow out the packing seals in that free lift cylinder. So you want to definitely limit it from moving so that we can get this intermediate rail here to come up. So you can see here the intermediate rail is coming up and the carriage is just resting on those jack stands, and I'm just going to keep coming up until the lower and upper bearings are completely exposed. Alright, at this point all I do is I just take a pry bar and I just work the lower bearings off, and then I'm going to take the upper bearings off. Now sometimes, you know, these don't just come off as easily. This is an ambient temperature truck, so it hasn't seen a freezer or anything, so luckily this stuff's pretty easy to come off. But you may have an instance where you have to cut them off with a torch or use an air hammer or whatever to get them off, but in this case it wasn't too bad. I'm just leaning the carriage forward to get it completely free of the mast channels so that I can get the bearing completely off. You want to be real careful, because you can work around with this carriage, but it's pretty heavy to actually pick it up. Now these trucks aren't that old. They only have about 6,000 or 7,000 hours on them. And so the shims that were behind these carriage bearings were in really good shape, so I just decided to reuse them, and they were fine. But you will have times where you find that these shims are in really bad condition and you need to replace them, but in this instance they weren't that bad, and so I just went ahead and put the bearings back on. Now at this point I'm just lowering the intermediate rail back onto the fork carriage, and you want to do this real slow. You want to make sure that you don't catch the mast on anything, and that you make sure that both upper and lower bearings are getting back in that channel, because you don't want to be surprised by thinking it's all the way down and it's not, and then when you're in there working around, it drops on you all of a sudden. Alright, so now the only thing I have left to do at this point is go ahead and put all the hoses and the chain back on and get it ready to put the attachment back on. The main thing that you want to be careful for when you're putting an attachment like this on is that there's actually a little lock that goes in the back, that mates with the fork carriage and the side shifter of this attachment. And most attachments, they all have some type of a lock. So you want to make sure that you get that lock on there. You see me pushing it over. As soon as I get it on the lock, it kind of falls into place. You want to make sure that you have that on securely and that the bottom of the attachment sits flush against the fork carriage. You do not want this thing to fall off on you while you're attempting to put everything back together. Okay, cool. So now I'm just putting the hoses back on. I'm going to do the hoses on the other side. And then the last order of business for this attachment is going to be to put the actual hooks on the attachment that hold them on to the fork carriage. And the reason why you put the hoses on first is because you're going to, on a lot of attachments, if you do not have quick disconnect hooks, then you're going to need to side shift the attachment left and right to be able to get these all the way on. Alright guys, and after that you just test all the functions of your attachment, make sure that everything works properly, and that's that. So thanks for watching this video, and I hope you guys have an awesome day, and we'll see you on the next time around.